Yes, hello everyone. This is late summer Brownbag. For you, all you guys who are for the first time here, so you're officially allowed to enjoy your meal if you have one. And today you have a wonderful guest with a very important topic, right? And she will introduce herself in a second. And usually after your input during presentation, we'll have a little discussion about the topic, and please keep your questions in the back of your head. And now please enjoy. Thank you for coming.
Great, thanks Manuel. So welcome and thanks very much for coming. My name's Louise. I know some of you here. I'm Swiss-Australian. I'm a social worker. And I've been working on an idea of using an apology as a tool to help us change our behaviors to help this climate crisis. And we're going to kick off today by going back to when I first became aware of climate change. And it was all the way back in 1991, 32 years ago. I was taken on a tour of a sustainable farm by a professor, and he showed us very clearly the impact that our obsession with economic growth was going to have on the natural systems that we need to survive. And he also explained clearly how we can live sustainably. But it was all a little bit brown, it was a little bit boring. I was 20, I wanted to grab as many experiences as I possibly could, and then more and more and more. So I turned away. And I hurried back to the bright lights of Sydney, and I got on with my life. And I travelled for work, I worked for travel. Travel was on my CV as my hobby. I never thought about consumption until I had no money to consume anything more. Vegetarians were pretty radical for me, and when they were no longer radical, I thought they were just really difficult to cook for. And I voted in every election, but I never voted specifically for green policies. I never voted or demanded that my government decouple from the fossil fuel industry and tackle the climate crisis. I pretty arrogantly thought of myself as a free thinker, and I comforted myself by the fact that I was a social worker doing good. But in fact, I was being lulled along by the conveniences of my life, and I was being nudged to contribute to the human activity that is driving climate change. I didn't mean to go out and harm the environment, but I was harming the environment by outsourcing my responsibility. It was only when my kids came back from school and started to ask me, why are we learning about climate change at school, but we're not doing anything about it? Not us at home, not really the people we know, not society. And of course I could give a decent explanation about the power of the fossil fuel lobby groups and the link between jobs and economic growth and the complexity of multilateral, bilateral agreements. And they said, well, okay, that's really interesting. But why are we still eating meat? And at the end of these conversations, I often found that all that I could really say was, yeah, you're right. We don't need the meat. I'm sorry. What did I mean with this sorry? For me, it meant two things. Firstly, I was recognizing the harm that my kids were expressing. When I finally listened to them without judging, I could see that climate change was already having an impact on their lives, both at the big level, in terms of their anxiety about what climate change meant to the systems that they need to live, to food supply, to water supply, to stable social, economic, political systems, to their future, to their jobs. But I could also recognize that they were facing harm at a personal, daily level, as they struggled to balance what they wanted to do, on the one hand, and what they felt was their responsibility. A responsibility that I never paid any attention to. It's very easy in the face of these big harms that climate change poses to forget about this small daily harm. I often feel annoyed still that I can't fly guilt-free the way I used to. So, I thought it was interesting when Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, recently had a temper tantrum when a journalist asked him about his use of private jets. And actually, I could kind of understand. I would probably also be annoyed if I had to consider downgrading to economy class. And it seems obscene and ridiculous to focus on this level of personal harm. But for the richest 10% of the world's population, which is a lot of us in Switzerland and a lot of us in Australia, who contribute 50% of the global emissions, it's important to recognize these feelings of personal harm, to recognize that climate mitigation, or what we can do about climate change, makes us feel afraid. It makes us feel afraid of loss. It makes us feel afraid of change. It makes us feel afraid of losing what gives us a sense of security and identity and safety and comfort and convenience. And when we feel this, we turn away. It's too difficult to deal with. And of course, the more power and the more money and the more influence we have in the systems that are driving climate change, the more threatened we feel by what we need to do about climate change, and so the more likely we are to fight to keep what we have. So, in saying sorry to my girls, I was firstly recognizing these feelings of harm, which they feel on a daily basis. The second reason I was saying sorry was to acknowledge my role in this harm. And at this point, I'd like to introduce somebody new into the room. I'd like to introduce you to Lou. Lou, of course, is short for Louise. And Lou is my armchair environmentalist. She tells everybody else what they need to do about climate change, so I can sit back and continue with my life without changing anything. You might know her cousins, perhaps the armchair politician, who tells politicians how to fix the world while never being a member of a political party, or perhaps the armchair footballer yelling at the team to go faster, 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 while sitting back on a beer and having a cigarette on the sofa. Like our other internal voices, the inner critic perhaps, or the inner child, Lou plays an important role. She doesn't care about the environment. She simply wants to protect me. She wants to protect me from my fear of climate change, and she wants to protect me from my fear of change, my fear of losing things that I have. And in doing this, she comes up with some great excuses. She says, India and China have to do something. The government has to regulate. And sometimes perhaps she'll comfort me and she'll say, don't worry, Louise, there's going to be a tech solution. And anyway, your actions really don't matter. Yeah, so you do what you want, it's okay. I call these excuses because Lou only gives half the truth. She very conveniently deflects my attention away from what is my responsibility in these excuses. So when she says that India and China have to do something, of course they do, she's right. But I also have to remember that the CO2 emissions from my SUV, from my new renovation, from my skis, from my clothes, they belong to me and not to the factory in China. And when she says that governments have to regulate, she's right, they do, urgently. But governments are simply a collection of individuals who, like me, are desperately trying to maintain their status quo. And they're not going to do anything unless I vote for them to do something, and unless I support organizations which can amplify my concern and put pressure on them to do something. And when she tries to comfort me with this idea of a tech solution, again, she's right, and certainly enough money is being pumped into this. But when I take my responsibility to read the science, I also know that currently there is no tech solution that can be scaled up in time to save us from this climate crisis. It's going to take a tech solution, many tech solutions, and in India and China, and every government, and me and you doing everything that we can. And when she says that my actions don't matter so I can do what I want, I must also remember that I live in a capitalist democratic society. And companies and governments court my vote and my money on a daily basis. Coca-Cola spent $4 billion last year on marketing to get me and you to buy their bottle of Coke. And Trump is up on charges for trying to manufacture just 11,780 votes. Our actions matter. They're intrinsic to the system that we live in. Our actions are also intrinsic to the solutions to this climate crisis. Now, Lou at the moment is jumping up and down saying, yeah, but you don't have a choice. And again, she's right. As a migrant from Australia living in Switzerland, if I want to see my siblings again, I'm going to have to fly to Australia. People are locked into choices that they feel they can't change. They're locked into jobs or places that they live. They have family responsibilities. They have financial constraints. They have mental health problems, physical health problems. But the fact that I am going to fly to Australia again doesn't mean that I can't take a whole range of other actions to contribute to the solutions to this climate crisis, to contribute to the climate future of my loved ones. So, I said sorry to my girls in order to recognize the harm they feel and to acknowledge my role in the harm and the solutions. But we all know that sorry is a very hollow word if it doesn't change anything. So what kind of change is the climate apology interested in? The information about what we need to do individually as humanity for this climate crisis is available online in every available format, and it's been available for 5 decades. If I can book airline tickets to get me across the world online, and I can book Airbnb accommodation in countries where I don't even speak the language, I can Google a vegetarian recipe, and I can Google a footprint calculator. The fact is, we don't want to make the changes to our lifestyle because it's difficult, because it's uncomfortable, because it makes us feel afraid of loss of convenience, loss of comfort, loss of status, loss of money, loss of time. The climate apology jumps right into this emotional turmoil. It jumps right into this moral dilemma. It has 3 steps, and these 3 steps turn us inwards to try to find the emotions that research has shown are common to environmentally friendly behaviors. So when I recognize the harm that my loved ones feel, I'm fostering a feeling of empathy or sympathy, which can also be turned inwards, a little bit of self-empathy for the difficulty that I face. And when I acknowledge my role in the harm and in the solutions, I'm fostering my personal responsibility. My actions matter. My actions contribute. And when I change my behavior, I'm fostering a feeling of altruism. Instead of acting in my own self-interest, I'm acting in the interest of those that I love. Thinking about polar bears or islands sinking under the Pacific Oceans are horrors of the climate reality. But they're also horrors that I can very conveniently file away in that distant time and place drawer of my mind and forget about. It's much more difficult with the climate apology, which brings climate change right into my core relationships. It personalizes climate change, making it more difficult for me to turn away, and making it easier to find these emotions of empathy, of responsibility, in order to do the right thing for those that I love. So the climate apology, is interested in changing my mindset. It wants to change how we see ourselves. So instead of seeing myself as this isolated individual concerned only with more, being the most successful, being the best, gathering more experiences, it's asking me to change how I see myself as being intrinsically part of the systems that I live in. Targeting individual behaviors is virtually impossible. Getting the right message for the right behavior at the right time, at the right phase of life, according to my situation, that's the same for everybody else, it's virtually impossible. It's like a whack-a-mole game. The climate apology is seeking a change in how we view our role. And it wants us to become a climate mitigator. And so, becoming a citizen who votes for the governments to do something, who supports organizations which put pressure on governments to do something. It asks us to become a consumer who consumes less, a consumer who reduces CO2 emissions, reduces methane emissions. It asks us to become a professional who contributes in whatever way that we can. Obviously, an oil executive or a policy maker has far more direct impact on climate mitigation than the person on the factory floor. But the person on the factory floor can vote for these people to do something, and they can support organizations to get these people to do something. The climate apology asks us to be an investor who thinks about how their money is used and to make sure that their money is not used to fund the fossil fuel industry. And it asks us to be a loved one and a friend who's able to talk about these things, who's able to talk about their feelings and is able to talk about the change and to show empathy, because change is not easy. In the climate apology, sorry is more than just a word. Sorry is the disruptor. Sorry means to stop what we've been doing and to think. And it's an opportunity to be part of the solution, to be part of the change. It's a time, a moment, a pause to reflect on what our actions mean for our loved ones, as well as for the systems which are driving climate change. It's an opportunity to reduce our consumption, but also to reduce our apathy, to start doing something. And the word sorry focuses us on you and yours, or me and mine, doing what I can for the climate future of my loved ones. It's a small word. We all know it. It exists in our head. It doesn't need to be produced. It doesn't need electricity. And it can pop up when I'm standing at the meat counter deciding whether to buy that delicious leg of lamb, or whether I'm deciding whether I should take my bike or the car because it's raining. And it can pop into the head of the oil executive when they're deciding whether to approve plans to explore for new oil wells. And it can pop into the mind of the banker who's deciding whether to fund the oil company to make further oil exploration. And it can pop into the mind of the policymaker when they're deciding how to regulate the oil companies. It's a tool that we all have within us that we can use to give us time to think and to change our behavior. The climate apology worked for me. It moved me from thinking about what I want to do, what my priorities are, to being a person who can now say, sorry. So when Lou pops into my mind, which she still does on a daily basis, and says, oh, go out and take the car, buy the meat, you need a short weekend breakaway because you're tired, I'm now much more able to say to her, yeah, actually, sorry. I want to, but no, I'm not going to, because it's not worth the climate future of those that I love. The process hasn't been linear. It's certainly, there are certainly many steps to take, but it's been a very positive and powerful process of getting me to do what I can for those that I love. It's very easy to imagine that in 20 years or in 50 years, the head of the UN is going to get up and issue a climate apology to humanity for the climate disaster that we'll be living in on behalf of humanity. And it's easy to imagine because this is what we do. We've done it for slavery, we've done it for colonialism, we've done it for institutionalized child abuse. Let's not waste this tool that we know how to use. I can recognize now the harm that my children face, that my nieces and nephews face, that my siblings face, that I face. I can acknowledge that I have been making excuses for far too long, and that I can be part of the solution because my actions matter. They matter to the system, and they matter to those that I love. And I can choose to act in the interests of those I love, instead of in my own self-interest. Together, we've got this. So that's my input. And now I think we can open it to any questions or discussions or comments. I'm going to take a seat.
In changing people's behaviour, do you think it's more effective to use the carrot to pull people with you or the stick to push them?
That's a good question. I think that if we see where we are now with climate change and the emphasis that's been put on trying to motivate us in a positive way, I think it's time to say it's worth trying another tool or putting another tool in the toolbox. It's worth giving it a go. The problem is, I think, with positive motivation is that we respond very quickly and very easily to it. We get a little dopamine hit, we might get a little adrenaline rush, it becomes quite addictive. And so we focus on the immediate positive, and we have always problems trying to focus on the long-term positive effects of something. Living sustainably or protecting the environment, there are huge benefits, there are huge positives to us all, but they're long-term. And we find it much easier to respond to the short-term positives. But I also think there have been some interesting studies which have been done, for example, which show that giving people a positive message can in fact relax them and make them less motivated to change. So there were some interesting experiments done, for example, with people who were slightly dehydrated, and they were asked to imagine that they were drinking water. And they relaxed, which is great, it's good to be happy. But then if we've got this feeling that it's okay, it's going to be okay, you don't need to worry, we're less motivated to do something. I think it's really important that we take this first step of recognizing the reality of the problem that we face and acknowledging our role in this. And then the positives come from that. And I think also it's not this your sort of very polarized view of positive and negative. The middle way is let's be realistic. And I think the idea of a tool which gets us to focus inwards on what the blockages are, why do we find it so difficult to take these small steps, is an effective way to travel down this middle path, the realistic path. Are there any other questions or comments?
I'm interested in the symbol that you have there. Is there a sort of significance to your reason for using the symbol?
Yeah. So it's an old symbol. It's called the Triskelion. I think it's about 4,000 years old, originally from Malta, but then has been found on ancient ruins throughout Europe and is now also related to, I think, the Irish culture. I think it's a symbol that actually it's used quite often for tattoos, I think, these days. For me, it lends itself to a whole range of symbolism depending on who you are. It can be the male, the female, and the procreation of a new life. It can be the elements, the earth, wind, fire, the elements that we need. It can have a spiritual meaning. I think that it can be used by different people as a way to trigger, along with this word apology. It's a symbol that can remind us to do something. And for me, it's also a reminder that we want to try to bring, to be the caretakers for the next generation. We've inherited this symbol from 4,000 years ago. Let's try and hand it on to the next generation. Any other?
Another question. What is the reaction like? I mean, our generation, this is something that we have to take responsibility for, the new generation. How does the new generation react to your message, your girls, or their friends, or that younger generation taking it on?
Yeah. Again, I think it varies, and for my girls, it makes a lot of sense, and they find it a useful concept. But I think we all live in a bit of a bubble. So, okay, their friends also find it useful. But I think it's not necessarily an intergenerational issue. We certainly have to take responsibility for what we've done. But I think there are people across all the generations who are doing what they can, and those who are not doing what they can. And so I think it's very much a personal issue. I have full sympathy with people of my daughter's generation because, as I said, I remember being 20. You know, I remember wanting the more, the more, the more. Of course you do at that age. And I feel sorry for them that they're faced with a dilemma or a responsibility that I simply chose not to take, even though I knew about it. And I'm impressed with how many of them are acting responsibly. Yeah.
So choosing our green energy companies and voting for the politicians who are going to make those changes, that's going to have quite a chunk of impact. Is that what we're saying? Yes. That's
yeah. I think this is it's part of the dissonance of climate change. It's very difficult to accept that changing my energy company and voting for a green policy is going to have any difference whatsoever. It's really hard, this gap. We fall into this gap and we get paralyzed. The fact is, those actions mean a lot to my kids, and it means a lot to other people that I love. So at that very personal level, I think we can see an effect, and it's important. The reality is, if more and more of us are doing it, we have this social tipping point, and yes, it does become effective. But if we wait for the super rich to do it, or for the politicians to do something, we're in a bit of a deadly standoff game, and we're all going to suffer. Yeah.
I have a question. You know how, I don't know how many years ago, but there was the ice age?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ice age. What if we're at the point now where we would go into another ice age? Will we panic the same way? Because the world survived the ice age,
Mm-hmm.
and now we get into the opposite technically.
Mm-hmm.
What if it would be an ice age now? Would we also be like, ooh, but then in the end we just survive it? I don't have an answer, it's just thinking. Then another one is, I feel like sometimes with the green stuff, it's more greenwashing because you say, hey, I drive an electric car, and then you have the battery and the electricity comes from the oil.
Yeah.
And the third thing is that was in New Zealand, the CO2 and stuff.
Yeah.
So there's too much, and then they had a refinery, and they closed it, and because of that, they had to import CO2 from other countries with ships. So we have too much in the atmosphere, and then we shut down. What if we shut down the refineries and then there is one left, and then we just ship it everywhere? It doesn't really make it better trying to shut it down. So what's the, like, how do you manage around? Because it's either everyone or no one, kind of. Because if you have one left and then they just ship it everywhere, it's not that there isn't really a point, right?
For me, this is my Lou talking, huh? Well, and I have these often. There's no point. It's too difficult. Okay, if I think Switzerland, this is a really topical issue in Switzerland. If we do something, we're such a small country, it's just going to disadvantage us if nobody else is doing something. I think this becomes a great reason not to do anything. And I think this idea of empathy is important because it is difficult, it is confusing, it's incredibly complex. So as an individual, it's overwhelming. Anchoring ourselves in what it means for our loved ones and how we move through our day, I think, is a much more manageable way to look at it. And then those people, those individuals who are having to make the decisions about energy policy, for example, can put on their professional hat and together with other professionals decide, what is the right thing for the climate future of my loved ones? I think we need to avoid falling into this gap of confusion and complexity. In terms of your question about the Ice Age or sort of normal patterns that go back in the Earth's history, it's clear that whatever happens, nature will survive, and people will survive in some way or other. The fact is, we're living now with people that we love now, and hopefully those people also want to have their own children. There'll be other people. We have a responsibility to do what we can now for our own future, but also for those we love, and not just say, okay, it'll be okay. Nature will survive, or there'll be people will survive. We have a responsibility because we love people, because we're part of the system, to contribute to that. The idea of the climate apology, anyway. Yeah.
Another question that came to mind: if we get to the point where everything is good, how will that generation actually live? Like, what will the new things be that they will be? What will they do? What's their daily life?
Well, to promote the Effingerstrasse, I think this is a great example, actually, of how people might choose to live in the future. I mean, remembering, of course, that we live in the most privileged of societies, and there's a lot of countries and a lot of people who have a long way to catch up. But I think this kind of co-working space where people are sharing resources in an environment which tries to have as minimal impact as possible is actually a great example. And prioritizing not just work, but living in a community. I don't know, I mean, perhaps you two might want to say something about that, but for me, I think it's really an example of how we could imagine people living in future.
But I think also on that note, we have technology, don't we? You can have your 3D goggles to go and experience Niagara Falls, sitting in your co-working space.
In your armchair, right?
In your yes, but so our drive to go and experience these things personally may just have to be a thing of the past. We could experience actually near enough everything now with technology, and we can feel as if we're in that space, and it might be that the future is more that actually, what are you doing tomorrow evening? Oh, I'm going to Niagara Falls, and then I'm going to Ayers Rock. what are you doing? I don't know, but actually the luxury of being able to physically move ourselves to all of these locations has been absolute luxury, but it comes at a hell of a cost, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So it might be that that's how things change in the future. Yeah.
And that perhaps also in changing our mindset, that we change what we're valuing as well. And we can value experiences in different ways. It can be Niagara Falls, but equally I could learn to value sitting with loved ones and having a great laugh and a great conversation. We've also been socialized into associating good experiences with consuming. We can equally relearn. And I think this is where sort of communities which are happening now are an interesting example of that. Yeah.
I think we've talked a lot about privilege, and this is a very topic. We are privileged to experience these things or have experienced things, but I think now we need to go back to a much calmer and maybe more tight-knit kind of way of living. More local and more community-based instead of outsourcing everything all the time and moving around and just focus more exactly on the people around us and the people we love. Because I think in society today, everyone is everywhere all the time, no one's really focused on one thing. And we need to concentrate more on living life in a smaller way and less in a bigger way and consuming everything.
Yeah. And recognizing that in that there is also joy.
Yeah.
We're not used to identifying the joy in that because we have been socialized to be consumers in the society that we live in. But in fact, there's an awful lot of joy in belonging to a community and in living in that environment and that space.
More joy because then you can value it more. If you're constantly consuming so many different things all the time from everywhere in the world, like YouTube, Netflix, all the social media, you value the small things less. And I think, especially for me and the people around me, we don't want that anymore. We don't want to be consuming everything. There's so many people giving up on social media and everything like that in my bubble. And I think maybe there's a change of behaviour and a change of mindset coming in some small pockets and that could spread. I don't know, we'll see.
I mean, I find that so encouraging. And I think that it's that kind of experience which needs to get amplified so that others can learn from this.
But maybe it is this generation who can see things differently.
Yes.
The message you've got to listen to.
Yes. Yeah.
This generation.
Yeah.
So what's your thought about movements like Friday for Future and how they approach the whole topic?
I think the energy is incredible. I think it's absolutely amazing what they've achieved. And I think it takes a whole lot of actions, people doing a whole lot of stuff in lots of different ways. I also have sympathy for organizations which are taking far stronger action like Extinction Rebellion. I think that's just a reflection of this climate dissonance. Some people turn away from climate change, it's just too difficult. Other people take really serious action because it is so difficult. It's just the polar ends of the same psychological process that we don't know how to deal with this crisis. So I think these movements are really important. As you know here, there's another demonstration in Bern on the 30th of September. I think it's important to put pressure in public to show the people who are working in governments, to show the people who are working in the fossil fuel industry, who can make the policy, to show them that we're worried, that we want to change. Yeah. Any other questions? I guess I'm interested, this idea of Lou, of this armchair environmentalist, of these excuses that we have in our head. Did that resonate with people? Did that make sense for people?
Because I do starting to play my part, the recycling, the electric car, but I always think, what difference am I really making?
Yeah.
And that's always,
Yeah.
do all this, is it really making a difference? But then you'll think, well,
Yeah.
that's what we've got to keep doing,
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
the reasoning why we're doing it.
Yeah.
It's not the big picture, it's in a small
Yeah.
group.
Yes.
Your way of having Lou, it's sort of an accessible way for people to understand. It's a sort of identifiable way to, an armchair environmentalist. You can really, really picture it in your mind, just sitting back and saying, yeah, do that, do this.
Yeah.
It's a very accessible way to put this concept into something we recognize in ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very good thing with both the armchair environmentalist and also the mitigator, the one who's a bit more, let's up there and do something. Yeah, it's a identifiable way. So I think they're quite good characters to have in your whole concept, because sometimes it can be a little bit it's getting out of my understanding of it.
Yeah.
But that sort of gives you a good identifiable person.
Yeah.
You can see it in yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, we talk about why should I do something when Rishi Sunak is still going to fly? Why shouldn't I fly if Rishi Sunak's going to keep his private jet? Rishi Sunak is going to have his own armchair environmentalist. He's got to face his own demons, his own excuses, and address these excuses and change them. But they're not my excuses. I'm only responsible. It's an old idea of being responsible for what we can be responsible for. And I think that this idea of focusing on our own excuses is useful. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
I have another question.
Good.
And again, if we make it and we do it, let's say, with no technology, we just shut everything down in the sense of no driving, vegetarian and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it will last? Or I feel like in the end, there's going to be the generations that can't associate with the wars anymore. We're like, it's just, it goes so quickly. And so I feel like in 2-3 generations, won't we be at the point again where we're like, they had such cool things, we want that again. And so if you would go through technology and actually say, hey, you can have the same thing with less impact, wouldn't that be, it would take longer, definitely, but wouldn't it be longer lasting?
I think we like to have efficient machines. We expect our technology to be efficient. Unfortunately, we don't use it efficiently. We have produced ever more efficient light bulbs, for example, but we're using more and more electricity. There has to be, technology has to play a role in all of this. That's really clear. It's not going to be the only solution. How we use the technology, it's still a very important issue. Lou can jump up and down and say, yeah, well, okay, that's efficient, so I can do what I want. But actually, I still have to use my efficient technology efficiently. And I think, we see this with, it's going to be clear with electric cars, for example, along with all the other problems that they bring and how we're going to get the resources to build that and to meet the demand. But if we all want an electric car and then we want the latest model of our electric car every 3 years because we're leasing it and we get a better leasing package, we're back in exactly the same problem that we have. On your other point about what does the future look like, for me, one of the nice things for me about the symbol of the triskelion is this constant movement. And who knows what the future will bring, but certainly there will be constant change, that we know. And the generations who are living or who are making the decisions in 20 or 30 or 50 years will be faced with a new set of challenges. But this process is the history of humanity, and it's not going to, we're stuck with this problem at the moment that we need to solve, but that then will open up new challenges. That's clear. And this cycle will continue.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you very
good.
much. Louise?
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks.